As Washington, D.C.'s central library, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library serves D.C. residents from every neighborhood and culture in our city, with offerings ranging from makers labs to town halls, co-working to concerts. We go well beyond books. Here, artists and activists, teachers and learners, toddlers and seniors converge to explore our city's past and the infinite potential of its future. Because the MLK Library is not only a place to be quiet, it is a place to be heard, to be understood. It is a place to explore the possibility of all we can be. It is a place to just be. Welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, celebrating 50 years as Washington, D.C.'s first memorial to Dr. King.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. I'm sure you all noticed it's a little bit warm in here. And even in newly modernized buildings, the switch from cold to warm is, I guess, a problem that we still haven't solved with all of our modern technologies. But so I apologize. I hope that this talk is so interesting that you forget that you might be a little bit uncomfortable. I know that it also said that this talk would be 2 hours from 6 to 8 p.m. I think that's long, and I think we all agree that that's long. So hopefully we'll get out of here in an hour or so, depending on how much you guys are enjoying yourselves. We can go on a little bit longer, but it would be great if we could end early enough so you guys can maybe enjoy the sunset up on the 5th floor on the roof deck. So with that, let's see, other housekeeping issues. Please make sure that you keep your masks on. We still are a masks on government in DC. And I think we'll get started. Great. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, winner of the prestigious 2021 Richard H. Driehaus Foundation National Preservation Award. I am Richard Reyes-Gavilan, Executive Director of the DC Public Library, or as I like to refer to us when I'm speaking with Rebecca Miller, the other DCPL. Get it? DC Preservation League? Bad joke. In all seriousness, it's an honor to partner with the DC Preservation League on this event tonight that celebrates 2 grand 50th anniversaries, the opening of the MLK Library and the birth of the DC Preservation League. So thank you, Rebecca, for working with us on this great event. Over the next hour or so, we will talk about 50 years of preservation in Washington, D.C., with a natural focus on the efforts to preserve the landmark building in which we are sitting. And we'll touch upon the future of preservation, which I think is a really interesting topic in 2022. We will also be taking questions from you all in the audience. Cards have been or are being distributed where you can jot down your thoughts, and I will read as many of those questions as time allows. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I should say by way of introduction that I'm really the newbie up here, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about this library's history from our speakers. My first day of work at the DC Public Library in this building was Tuesday, March 4th, 2014, the day after a large snowstorm had shut down the city. About 20 minutes after my human resources orientation, Meccano Architects, the team hired to design the new MLK, showed up in the office, my office, from the Netherlands, ready for their first day of work. It was an exhilarating start to my new job. I remember ending the very long day across the street at Zaytenya with the Meccano team toasting this incredible project, but thinking that none of us know what we're doing or what we're getting into. I certainly had a lot of experience running and rethinking large urban central libraries at both the New York Public Library and Brooklyn Public Library. I either led or participated in major efforts to rethink the role central libraries play in the lives of their residents. But in both those instances, I had the benefit, of course, of being a native New Yorker and had years of experience working within the systems to better understand how they worked and how services might be improved. There was no such opportunity for perspective here in DC. It was put your luggage down over in the corner and get to work. So beyond knowing immediately upon my arrival, that this building had profound problems, its rich and complex history was unknown to me. And that is what so excites me about being here with the three panelists tonight. All of you are significant actors in the longer, more complicated, and some might say more compelling story of the MLK Library. Going back to the first years of the new millennium, Phil, you were writing about this building. Rebecca and Anne, you were both working to save this building, and we'll get into your different approaches to that end in a bit. You were all expecting perhaps a fourth panelist tonight, Gary Martinez of OTJ Architects. Gary unfortunately had an unexpected conflict, and since Gary is not here, I will take a moment before we begin to recognize the efforts of his closest colleague, Tom Johnson, who served as the lead historic preservation architect for this project. Many of you knew Tom, and you know he passed away suddenly in the summer of 2017, just as construction was getting underway, and we all miss him. He would be very, very proud of this building. With that, I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Rebecca Miller, our co-host tonight, is the executive director of the DC Preservation League, and you've been head of the Preservation League since 2003, so almost 20 years, which is amazing. Very significantly, Rebecca represents the Preservation League as a consulting party in issues such as the MLK Library modernization, which is covered by the Section 106 process of the National Historic Preservation Act. Anne Brockett, to my immediate right, is an architectural historian with the Historic Preservation Office. Anne and David Maloney are the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer, were the HPO leads on the MLK project. And I couldn't tell how long you've been in that role. I saw maybe at least through 2007, going back or further back?
I'm along with Rebecca, 2003.
2003, great. And finally, Phil Kennicott, who is the chief art and architecture critic of the Washington Post, winner of the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, and author of Counterpoint, a memoir of Bach and mourning. In some ways, I would just like to turn it over to Phil, and the three of us go sit down and just have Phil talk about this building. You know, we'll do our best to keep up. So I've got three opening questions for each of you, and we can take them one at a time. They're not necessarily very long ones. Rebecca, we'll start with you. So exactly how long have you been working on or writing about preservation issues in DC, and specifically, what role have you played in the history of this building?
Certainly. So I started in April of 2003, so this is entering to my 19th year as of now. And when I started at DCPL, they were actually already in the throes of trying to save this building because it had already been DCPL's Landmarks Committee, which was headed by Alex Padro, who is here joining us in the front row, was very concerned about the state of the building and also what the future held for it. There were lots of calls for possibly a new library. Would you demolish this one, build a new one? Would you build one up the street? It was, not even, obviously at that point, it was only 30 years old. But it is the only Mies building in Washington, D.C. It's the only library that he designed that ever was built. So it was a very special building. So I was kind of thrown into the throes of it. DCPL was also wrote the nomination and was the sponsor of it. And then it was designated in 2007. So it has been the majority of my career. So it's so great to see it come to fruition and spend our 50th anniversary here too.
Awesome. Anne, yes. Same question. Can I borrow your pen? I seem to have lost mine. That's not part of I won't ask you guys to borrow your pens. Anyway.
So the question is, how did I become involved in
preservation here in DC, and your role specifically working on this project.
Sure. It's interesting how I wound up in DC. I went to graduate school in preservation, and I couldn't really figure out what direction I wanted to go career-wise. So I sort of pegged DC because we are both, the Historic Preservation Office is both the municipal planning organization for the city, and we do homeowner building permits. And we are the State Historic Preservation Office, which has federal and state level responsibilities. And I thought, well, then I get to do everything. So, and I made it into the office that I wanted to get into. So almost 20 years ago, so I have no complaints. And I started working on this building as a researcher, as a user, probably in the early 2000s. And it was in rough shape then. And I was really pleased. We started talking about it before you submitted the nomination, so that would have been 2006 probably, or earlier.
It was submitted in 2005, if I recall correctly. And
so I was assigned to it because I really like modern architecture, and it's a Mies building, and that's a great privilege for somebody in my position. So I was happy to shepherd it through the nomination process, the designation process, and then subsequently, you know the most about that building. You can do all the architecture reviews too, and which was, again, a great treat. So no complaints.
Awesome. And Phil, how long have you been writing about this building, and how long have you been writing about architecture, I guess?
Let's see, I came to Washington in 1999. I was writing about classical music, and I remember using this building in such form as it was then because it had the musical score library.
Still do.
On the second floor, right. And I remember taking note in a kind of unconscious way when I got in the elevators and hoped they made it to the second floor, and walked through this kind of dark, cavernous corridor down to the music library. That this was a building that was in want of some love. I started writing about architecture a little later, probably around 2003, 2004. As the Post, like many other newspapers, went through a period of some economic distress, there were portfolios empty, so we lost our architecture critic, and I remember picking up that portfolio around 2006 or 7. I was certainly paying attention to architecture when the question of whether or not they were going to landmark the building was in play. Because I remember thinking about, the challenges of convincing the broader public that this was a building that was worth landmarking, given that I think the consensus was it was a building that wasn't really serving people very well at that time. So I've been writing about it since then, and with greater attention as we got closer. I think 2017, there was a competition for various designs. I wrote about that. And then this summer came back, I think we walked through the building together while it was still mainly finished, but still a hard hat place.
In 2020.
Right.
Yeah. Great. And Rebecca, you've already touched on this. I wanted to get each of your recollections on the idea to sell and relocate this library. Do you remember when you first heard that and what your thought was at the time?
I think it was my first day at DCPL, to be quite honest. And there was, DCPL was in the throes of another issue with regards to mid-century modernism. It's been a big push of ours for the last 20 years at this point, and it's generally underappreciated, and so we were leading this effort on modernism across the country, actually, and calling a program called DC Modern. And the idea, and I'll just stand on my soapbox for a second, that the DC government is not the best stewards of its buildings. You'll find lots of their buildings on DCPL's most endangered places list. And what we find a lot of the time is there's a lack of investment in the buildings, and then which costs more than to rehabilitate them or adaptively reuse them for something else. And that is what we saw with this building. It had this, tremendous support in the early 70s. It had this amazing world-class architect, and then they didn't do anything with it for 30 years. And so as buildings begin to deteriorate and they need additional love, people start thinking, well, we should maybe look at building something new. And not only is that not environmentally friendly, it's also, from a preservation perspective, a catastrophe for cities, because you can see what happened to the city in the late 1960s when DCPL was founded as Don't Tear It Down in 1971. Most of downtown was parking lots. And there were just teeth of historic buildings around. And so we're lucky to have what we have now because of organizations like DCPL.
Phil, do you remember when this building was first, when there were discussions of selling it?
I think that was around 2007, 8, a little after.
That was when it was landmarked.
That
So
was
I'm
landmarked, so,
assuming
okay,
that
good
it was the idea to sell came earlier. Do you remember having a reaction to that?
You know, I remember, if we're going back before 2005, I think at that point, I was a newcomer to the city. And my experience with cities had been New York, St. Louis, and Detroit. And these are cities, St. Louis and Detroit were cities that just tear things down all the time. I mean, they tear down amazing, beautiful 19th century buildings because a developer comes in and says, I will update and rehabilitate this building, but I need parking all around it, so we're going to take these other 4 down. And I remember watching that during the years I was in those cities and thinking this is a terrible way to try and revive downtown. The notion of tearing this one down became more and more sort of disturbing to me as it became clear that I think DC was really undergoing a period of rapid development, but without a lot of guidance or structure. So that things were, gentrification was happening without it being directed or ameliorated, without the impacts being lessened on certain neighborhoods. And I remember even after after it had been landmarked and there was this idea of maybe doing some kind of hybrid use. Maybe we'll put apartments on the top. Maybe we'll put businesses in someplace. Gradually getting to thinking, we don't need to do that. This is a major city. This is, we can support a downtown library that is its own library building without all of that other stuff.
Great. Well, and I was so interested about that because I grew up in Seattle, which has a tremendous central library as well. And so I was so surprised when I came here and this was the first thought that they were, oh, well, we can turn this into an office building or we can tear it down. And as this building was going up, there was actually a tear down right across the street of the McGill building, which was an over-the-counter permit that DCRA issued, or whatever was the predecessor to DCRA. And so that, this was going up and that was being torn down at the same time. So you could see kind of in with the new, out with the old, and then the same mindset was happening. And the Office of Planning was really pushing that. And I think you can really credit the SHPO's office for standing up for this particular building.
Yeah, well, and what were your recollections? You had just gotten here, I guess, when that idea came about.
Right, and I don't recall calls for selling the building per se, but I do remember what Phil was referencing, the library coming up with different ideas for incorporating a use that to offset the cost of basically rehabbing or rebuilding a new library facility on the property. And so there were some pretty interesting architectural designs for like a bar of apartments on top of the library, or sort of split in half. It was it was an interesting discussion, and I think it needed to be held. And I think it pointed everybody's brain in the right direction, that the library would be perfectly self-sufficient and fine, and the landmark that it is if it was just a public library.
Great, so let me just fast forward to today and get each of your impressions, especially considering how many years you've all spent contemplating what a renovated MLK library could look like. Want to just share your candid impressions of what we've accomplished, all of us? You can start, Anne.
It's really rewarding because, I've been looking at it in 2D for 10 years about what the library would look like, and black and white plans have no, you think of things in 3D, but you don't actually know until you get into the space. And every time I come, I see a little new tidbit that I hadn't seen before, and I have not been in the auditorium before because it's been closed. And so I'm enjoying right now the curves in the back of the wall, because all of the new parts that were added and inserted are wholly different from the Miesian straight line principle. And
You made us do that.
And did I really? And the pattern, the pattern that was selected by the architecture team, so different than what Mies van der Rohe would have put in here. So I think it's a lovely contrast that works so well, that you have this very planar and very rigid form. It's a box, it's not complicated, and then you insert such organic forms into it. I think it's just rewarding to come in every time.
Great. Phil?
Well, I was going to point out, I noticed this as I came in, looking at the logo, if that's the new logo of the library, with that little tiny curve in the top, which takes the terrace, adds it to it. I have to give credit to your design team, whoever came up with that. I think it's a very clever way of showing the just sort of surgical interventions into the library that kept the bones of the Mies in good shape without really disturbing things. Today, walking from the metro, I was noticing these, I don't know what you call it, it'd be a Y with an extra angle on it. There's lights on the top floors that you can see just through the windows. The great thing about this library, and I think Mies's design, is that it responds late in the middle of the 20th century to this question that people have after the 19th century legacy of library designs, which is, how do you make a building that says library, but does not sit on an 18-foot plinth and require you to walk up a giant set of stairs and go into a monumental hall and then proceed through the card catalogs and then maybe up another monumental set of stairs to a ornate reading room? How do you come up with an idea of a library that's more democratic, but still feels different than an office building, still feels different than just any sort of generic downtown building? And I think he did a really good job of adapting his idée fixe of the grid to that idea. You enter in the ground floor, the library sits close, it feels comfortable in its horizontality, and you see these transparent windows, and through the windows you see books. And that's a great idea for 1950, 1970, when books are really the center thing. This idea that the library is a place of access, transparency is the thing. It suggests a metaphor for a broader sense of the importance of transparency and democracy. Now flash forward to remaking this building in 2017, in 2020, when books are an important but no longer the primary thing that libraries are necessarily doing. There are so many other functions. And so to have those little kind of very contemporary lights just peeking through the upper glass, I think, it lets the library be what it was when Mies designed it. And it also says that there's something more 2020 going on in the building.
Great. Rebecca?
Sure. Well, we're having our 50th anniversary celebration here on May 20th, so we're obviously think it's a wonderful job. I know when we first started reviewing it, so the original Mies design had a 5th floor, and it never materialized, and the city didn't have enough money. And so there were a lot of proposals for this 5th floor, and what would that look like? And so there was lots of different back and forth with the different consulting parties about whether or not it was acceptable or not. And dealing with the Park Service and all of these other things. But I mean, it's beautiful coming in here. I just remember coming down 9th one evening and thinking about where we were going to have our celebration, since it was put off from last year. And I was like, yes, this is where we're going to do it. So I think I called you the next day. And so we're very pleased with where it's come. And I think that that's one of the satisfying things, especially when you've started working on something nearly 20 years ago, to see it come to fruition and really be a gathering space for people to really enjoy it. And many people in here have been involved with this library since before even Anne or I were here working on it, or Phil. And so I hope that they've all thought that it's come a long way. So, and I know that there was some compromise that was made on both sides from a preservation perspective.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And I imagine it's got to be particularly satisfying to have your 50th anniversary event in a building that you were so instrumental in advocating for and saving. So that's got to be very special. Rebecca, let me stay with you, because we are not just talking about the library, and we do want to go back into the past, and I think many people do want to reflect on the past. So can you just tell me a little bit more about the Preservation League's evolution over the past 50 years? I myself don't know a lot about Don't Tear It Down. And then if you can sprinkle in, and you did a little bit in your intro, the specific role that that the Preservation League had in both designating this building as a landmark in 2007 and serving as a consulting party in, I guess, 2014 to 16.
Mm-hmm. So for those of you who don't know, Don't Tear It Down was founded in 1971 to save the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue. That was the it. Allison Owings was a reporter, a young reporter here in Washington, and she would travel, and then when she would come back, she would see other buildings demolished here in Washington. And so she went and talked to the National Trust and to other individuals wanting to know what could be done. And they said, well, we have this building on Pennsylvania Avenue that the government wants to tear down because it's just in the way, and they'd like to finish the neoclassical Federal Triangle. And so they, on Earth Day, 1971, they marched on the post office, and it was architects and advocates and environmentalists and just a swath of people who were interested in preserving the character of the city. And it took off from there. And many of the founders are still involved. Allison Owings is coming. David Bonderman, who wrote the preservation law that was passed in 1978 by the City Council and was implemented in 1979, he's coming to the event. I mean, this is something that's really important to these individuals who were in their 20s. And when you think of how people are today, how everybody's on the internet, there's lots of petitions and things like that. You don't necessarily see, in Washington we see it, where people are out picketing and doing things like that, but advocacy isn't as prevalent as it was in the 1970s. So it's really these individuals who had such an impact in the 1970s and really built the organization. And it had a lot of ups and downs, obviously. It became the DC Preservation League in 1984. To have a more citywide focused. Back in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of people downtown. There wasn't really a constituency. And then we expanded out, and there were other preservation organizations in the city, like Capitol Hill and Cleveland Park and DuPont, Circle Conservancy, who were doing a lot of the work in the neighborhoods. But our role now was, after we had the law that then made it so you couldn't just demolish buildings. You weren't just sitting there waiting 180 days to negotiate with a developer who never negotiated with you. Now we could stop the demolition and then have a process going forward. And that was really instrumental in changing the trajectory of how historic buildings were viewed in the city. And I think has had a dramatic change on the landscape here in Washington and a lot of the appreciation. I know that there are a lot of, there's lots of back and forth about how preservation stands in the way of progress in some ways, but I think you can see from the city how successful preservation has been, and that we're not a city that is held in amber by any means, because you see all these different things that are happening. And the preservation law in specific says that the Historic Preservation Review Board, which is the 9-member board that has the kind of final decision on major development projects, may apply the Secretary of Interior standards, and that may is kind of the key word, because it's a little more flexible here in Washington as to how preservation moves forward. And I think that that's kind of how we got to this point with the library as well, is that the flexibility that we've all discussed about the give and take between the two. Our Landmarks Committee obviously was interested in this building early on in the 2000s and late 90s, prepared the documentation for the building. That's a major function. We are the primary filer of nominations in the District of Columbia, and then advocating for its adaptive reuse. And so it's everything we've done since the get-go. And I remember one of the founders saying, when we started this, it was to educate people on the turrets. And I never imagined that it would get to this. And I'm like, well, we have the law now to save those turrets. And that's what's important.
So this building was on the most endangered, I guess,
most endangered places list.
Places list. And how long was it on that list?
It was listed in 2002. So it was on there for almost 2 decades.
And
It's off now, right?
Well, yes, we will be announcing a new list in a few weeks, and so it has come off the list. Yes, it is no longer endangered.
Great. And can you, just for those of us who don't know, you were a consulting party for the modernization, meaning that there was a very iterative back and forth with all the significant stakeholders who had a lot to say about how we would renovate this building. You got to weigh in at various points during the design phase. Can you talk about that process, which I found horrible, but you may have a different opinion.
Well, all the
kidding.
things
It
Anne
was
loved
good.
about coming to the SHPO's office are all the things that are difficult in Washington from an advocacy perspective, because It's a DC landmark, so it's protected under our DC law, but it has the jurisdiction of the Commission of Fine Arts because of its relationship to public buildings, the National Capital Planning Commission. And so you have all of these kind of hands in the cookie jar, and designing by committee is not necessarily how architects, and especially international architects, like to deal with things. And so, we're looking for good preservation, and obviously we can make compromise on certain things. Many of DCPL, the Committee of 100, other organizations in HPO, we tend to discuss things with each other and talk about, what is going to be the best thing for this building going forward. But as a consulting party, at the end of the day, we also still have the Preservation Act, which is, that issues the permits on the building. So this one is one of those situations where it was one of these quasi-projects, quasi-governmental projects, in the sense that it's not a federal building, but it does have all these kind of other jurisdictional people working in it. And as an advocate, we're not the decision makers. So it's, Robin Diener said outside that I'm the muscle of the preservation community because I'm just kind of the bulldog that keeps telling you to do something. Oh, and the brain, thank you. But at the end of the day, we are not the decision makers, and what we look for is to really gather public sentiment and collaboration from the community to really drive people in the agencies and owners in the right direction to do the right thing for historic buildings.
So let me pivot, and since we were trying to, while preparing for this talk, it's like we've got the advocate and we've got the regulator, right? So you're going at sort of the same ends from two different approaches. So can you talk a little bit about...
how long do we have?
a little while, but yeah, we'd love to hear about HPO's role here.
Right, Rebecca touched on it a little bit, and I'll back up a little, because it's very convoluted, because this is a DC landmark, and therefore it is subject to the review of the Historic Preservation Review Board, and I am a staff member to that board, so we make recommendations on preservation matters. So all of the changes would have gone through our board anyway for the exterior and the lobby, the first floor, which is a part of the landmark, the exterior and the main floor. However, it's also, the reason that it got the level of scrutiny it did is because of the National Capital Planning Commission's role. And they are a federal agency, and their review of the project triggered the federal Section 106 review, which is the SHPO, not the HPO side of my office. So we reviewed the exterior and the interior work on all floors to sort of gauge the amount of demolition, make sure this isn't just a facade that's being held up, and most importantly, when there is a project affecting where the Section 106 regulations come into play, where it's a federal project, when there is what we call an adverse effect to a historic building, something that isn't the best preservation approach, it's offset by something that is good for preservation. And we draft, as you know, a document called a Memorandum of Agreement, where we agree to do good things for preservation. And history and understanding a historic resource. So in the case of the library, there were quite a few items that the library undertook to offset, adding a floor, inserting new things. Even though they're good things, it is still an impact on a historic building. So the exhibit on Martin Luther King Jr., and an upcoming exhibit on Mies van der Rohe himself and his design for the library. Those were covered. Those were part of the sort of the balance of that were included. And there was a video that was produced on his work, and one of the architects who was heavily involved in his office was interviewed extensively for that website.
The archaeology, I think.
Yes, thank you. A big win for my office is that we were able to, and it's not just my office, it's the city, the history of the city. The archaeological collection is going to be stored here at MLK. So the library reserved a portion of its climate-controlled space, which is very important for preserving artifacts, is now dedicated to keeping the district's archaeological heritage, which is huge because the DC Archives has much of it now, and it is not climate controlled, and it is not
One day.
right. Right. Well, yes, and I have every hope for the DC Archives that they'll get moving. But yeah, that was a big win. So I mean,
And some of the collection will be on display as well.
the archaeological.
which it's not. at
Yes,
this
it
point.
is exhibit space and the storage space. So
And can I ask
Big
a
win.
follow-up question that's maybe slightly unrelated, but it fascinates me a little bit. As a member of the Historic Preservation Office, which is part of the city's Office of Planning, which is part of the city's Office of Planning and Economic Development, I see that there is there can be a natural tension between economic development and the work that you do to preserve buildings. So feel free to, kick the can on this, but I would love to know how you all just sort of work on that tension because, and you guys have touched upon it, in order to even bid on this project, you had to propose a standalone MLK library, but you also had to propose a library with housing on top. So how do you reconcile that in your day-to-day work when preservation might compete with, the bottom line, I guess?
well, I think the library is a good example of how you can balance things with new and old. They're not necessarily in competition. There are, of course, more heavy-handed approaches to historic resources. And it's an argument that can be made from both sides. One is financial, and one has the regulatory backing. So yes, your highest and best use of a parcel of land may be to build a 10-story luxury condo building, but we have nothing to say about use. If there's a historic building on the property, we're gonna do what the law requires us to do, which is to strive to protect it. That's not to say, every building is kept and things don't change, and there is a process for continuing the reviews to build something instead of that building that really isn't serving a purpose. Within our office, we've not had real knock-down, drag-out battles, I would say. There have been different deputy mayors who have come in that role in my years at the office, who are more pro-development than others, and certainly more mayors who are more pro-development. But we always seem to manage to work it out. And I would have to say that in most cases, I'm sure it's not all, but we do get comments from developers saying, our project is so much better that you participated. So it's probably, I probably only hear that out of, 1 out of 3,000 developers, but I have heard it.
But what's interesting about what Anne's talking about is that not every building is kept is one of the very important aspects of the preservation law. When it was being advocated for, there was an initial draft, and when it went to council, it was actually turned back because there wasn't a provision, I call it the escape valve, basically, which is the mayor's agent process, which is special merit, community benefit packages, work of a master architect, economic hardship. And when you're talking about preservation, and if you're not talking about a governmental building, if you're just talking about, say, private development, speculative development, there's no guaranteed return on your investment. Everybody wants a 27% return, but you're not guaranteed that in a speculative environment. And with the government, our view is that you have an obligation to the historic resources within your portfolio. And so you have to treat them with respect. And this is why in 2007, we actually updated the preservation law to include what we call a mini Section 106 for all DC government buildings to go through. And when Anne mentioned the 106, we always like to call it if you try to minimize any impact, and if you can't minimize it, you mitigate it. And I think that that's an important thing that the government now has to go through, school buildings, libraries, everywhere.
So let's stay in the end of that first decade of the new millennium. Phil, I've got to say, just rereading some of the pieces that you've written, It's just fascinating to me. So if it's okay with you, I pulled out a few quotes
Uh-oh.
from some of your articles, and I would love to just hear your feedback about them. So in 2010, you wrote about this library. The building has always been problematic, an austere and alien presence in a city temperamentally allergic to anything that isn't classical, brick, or bland. So can you expand upon that thought and maybe revisit it 12 years later?
I think that was probably fairly shortly after I started writing about architecture, and I was probably feeling a little constrained by the fact that at that point the Washington Post was really obsessively focused on Washington, D.C. So there were these amazing buildings happening in other places, but I was trying to kind of find ways to write about what was going on in Washington. And I think it did seem to me at that point that Washington was a pretty bland place architecturally. And maybe I'm not being as fair to Mies in that 2010 piece as I would be now rethinking it. I remember there were a few buildings. I remember Arena Stage opened, and I can't remember exactly the date on that, but it for an architecture writer, I felt like, wow, finally, here's something in DC that feels like it has a connection to the sort of the international architecture world. I don't think I could have conceived that this particular building would be so successfully repurposed if you'd asked me in 2010, as it has.
Another quote from that same article. I'll preface it. You were walking around and you just saw a lot of clutter in the building. Librarians were awful. We just love signage taped up to things. I pull them down, but they come right back up. You said these layers of accumulation, each a small response to a community need, deprive the building of the silence it needs to speak clearly. And I love that. The building needs silence to speak clearly. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, but I think that goes to the basics of Mies's design. There's not anything extra in this building. I mean, as it turns out, there are. Those I-beams are kind of ornamental, but let's pretend that they're structural. It's a building that wants to be minimalist in a really rigorous, authentic way. I remember, looking at this library long before the renovations, and the thing that always appealed to me most is that street level transparency into the building. You could see stacks of books there. I think that is the thing Mies gets right. That's the fundamental message of this library. But during this period, the library also wants to be much more community-oriented. So they're hanging posters in. They're announcing a festival of this or something coming up. And so where do you hang them? You hang them in the windows. And suddenly this thing that was so important about the design is now filled with these community things. Now, I'm not going to object to that because the library needs to do that. But clearly that is that's a provisional repurposing of those windows to do something else from what they were meant to do. And during the debate about what would happen to the library, keeping that transparency at the street level was the most important thing for me. And I think for the most part, you've managed to maintain it.
Okay, great. I can't believe we're already 45 minutes in, and I've got a lot of questions I want to ask you, and I want to get to some questions from the audience as well. Simple question just for all of you. Would Mies alone have saved this building from sale and destruction, or had the building not been named after Dr. King?
I think the Dr. King aspect of it was really what saved it. And it was really important in the early part of I guess it was 1971, it was the school board when they voted, or the library board when they voted on it. It was a vote of 5-2 to name it after Dr. King. And it was a letter writing campaign and very important to the public. And that was a lot of the articles that were coming out was about how this was there was no monument. There was no Martin Luther King Memorial on the mall. And this was the monument to Dr. King in Washington. So I think that was one that was very important. And mid-century architecture is something that is evolving in for people's love. And we call a lot of buildings like hard buildings to love, a lot of the mid-century brutalist stuff. And this is a beautiful building, but not everybody understands mid-century yet. It needs some more time for people to appreciate it. So I really think it was the dedication to Dr. King that was really important in saving it.
Phil or Andy, you guys have any thoughts there?
I would say both. I mean, the Mies is important to people who care about architecture. But remember, this building opens, I think, in 1972. This is only years after the assassination of King and the destruction of parts of Washington. So the building, I think, fuses those two ideas together just chronologically because of when it opens. To me, when I picture this building, I see it in black and white or Polaroid, and it is out of that period in the 1970s. So I think that they've kind of grafted onto each other.
Great. While we're talking about the sort of the King-Mies relationship, is something that we talked a lot about during design. Francine Hubin from Meccano, who is not here today, I really respected the fact that she tried to capture that. I mean, she spent a lot of time learning as much about Dr. King as she did about Mies, and I thought that she did a great job in trying to respect and balance both those things. One question that I would love for all of us to address, just looking forward. So in the last few years, especially in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, institutions like libraries and fields like journalism and fields like historic preservation, they've had to examine ways in which we protect and possibly advance white supremacy. I'd love for each of you to talk about that a little bit, and I'd love to start with you, Rebecca. I think just in the past 2 or 3 years alone, you read so much more about historic preservation as a tool to maintain the status quo, and that's just taken on such a negative connotation. And if you could parlay that a little bit into some of the things that you're doing in terms of how some of the work that the Preservation League is doing in terms of housing equity, climate, which is a huge equity issue. So I'd love to hear you start and respond to this.
Certainly. Preservation has been a tool for affordability across the country for decades and decades. We can even talk about how the numbers show. So even outside of the numbers of affordability, preservation is $1 billion business in this town. So when developers say, "Oh, I can't make any money doing that," it's systematically just untrue. It's not being very visionary and wanting to build, maximize their Florida area ratio and those types of things, and build it fast, build it cheap, and it'll be done in 30 years. And we won't have to worry about it again. And from an affordability perspective, we putting new affordable units, the housing crisis and everything like that in Washington, there's been lots of articles recently about it. It was like systematic, and Tony Williams was interviewed as saying, it almost didn't know what in retrospect, didn't really realize what the outcome was going to be, in the sense that all the encouragement of all of this development between 2016 and 2018, 18% of the affordable units that came online in DC were in historic districts or in historic landmarks, which there's 20% of the city that's designated. So could we do better? Yes. Are we trying to keep up? We really are looking at ways to make sure that the neighborhoods stay affordable. The building boom in DC has really taken its toll. Developers purchasing row houses and flipping them. I was just looking at a row house the other day. $100,000 at 1313 T Street over by 14th Street. It's $1.89 million today for sale, and it was $100,000 in 2005 when this person purchased it. And so I was just struck by that. And so there's a lot of different factors. Preservation's not the only factor that adds to the kind of affordability issues in the city. Preservation also, the idea of knowing what your neighbor can and cannot do is attractive to people as well. How we keep the city more affordable. We have some ideas of what we could do moving forward in order to keep different places affordable. But generally speaking, the studies that have been done by Place Economics, which is a research firm, this is what they look at historic preservation across the country. They just did a program for Dumbarton House, is that older, smaller buildings maintain affordability in cities where the new construction does not. And interestingly, there was an article in the New York Post the other day, or the Times, I can't remember which one, where the person argued for why you need luxury housing, because eventually it will become affordable for people. And And I'm like, great, so I can afford it in 10 years? Like, everybody deserves to have quality housing. And so it's just kind of everybody's different take on it. And I think that one thing that I wish in this city is that housing advocates and environmental advocates know that we are all actually trying to pull in the same direction. We're just coming at it from different angles. And even with DCPL started a new program this last year during its 50th anniversary it's called Stewardship for Climate Action. And we came to fruition during the dawn of the environmental movement. We're very dedicated to that. Obviously, historic buildings, as Carl Elefante says, the greenest building is the one that's already built. You take it down, you put it in a landfill, and the carbon that goes along with it, and the energy that goes with it is just going to sit somewhere else. And the embodied carbon in that. And one note that he gave me, which was interesting very early on when we were talking about this, is that if you have a very well-designed, adapted building that's already existing, whether it's historic or not, that your carbon becomes neutral after 10 years. Where if a brand new building, it's 2 generations, it's 40 years. And so you just have to kind of take that into consideration when people are like, well, we need to build more. And preservation causes sea level rise. Preservation causes urban sprawl. Preservation's not the only factor involved in all of these things that are going on. So we're really happy to be doing these climate action programming so that we can really learn from it and maybe make some recommendations to the city as to how historic buildings and existing buildings can help be a tool in meeting their climate goals for the city. Because I think that's really important to maintain our historic building stock and existing buildings in order to maintain our platinum city designation.
Great. And do you have anything to add there?
Well, not taking quite the economic approach. I think there's been a rise nationally. Before the Black Lives Matter movement, that was an interest in recognizing sites of historic importance that were not necessarily the traditional building or site or type of resource that one would seek to preserve. Like not the fancy buildings, not necessarily buildings, but a place that was used for people of color or minority groups that was, important to them for a historical purpose. And it does make it more difficult under the existing preservation law and the way that, you do designate things, but it's not impossible to celebrate historic resources that aren't traditional. And I think there are a lot of programs that are coming online now, both top down and bottom up, that are really focused on the same thing, which is celebrating a much, much richer heritage than the one we've traditionally been associated with. For instance, here in DC, we just designated the Seafarers Yacht Club in Southeast, which is honestly not the most attractive building, built in the 1960s. It's concrete block. It has nothing special to it, but it is an important place. This is a site that African American boaters could come and congregate when all of the other clubs in the city wouldn't let them be members. So, we need to tell the stories, and I think our office is certainly geared towards doing that, and not just, people of color, but, with the suffragette, the celebration of the anniversary of the suffragette movement, we've certainly been writing a new context on women's history. We have a grant from the National Park Service as an underrepresented communities grant, which we were awarded to study sites of LGBTQ significance to the city, which obviously DC is a huge center for that, and that needs to be celebrated. So hopefully the preservation of rich old white men's residences is not the future of preservation.
Thank you.
Sorry, that might have been a little bit biased. I caught a little bit. Sorry, gentlemen in the audience.
We're at an hour now, so we're going to wrap up and have some time for some Q&A. But as we've sort of veered a little political into the conversation, Phil, I want to go back to you and just sort of ask you about your mindset when you were writing about this building in 2020. A couple of couple of months before the election. Your review of this library was glowing, but it was steeped really in darkness and pessimism. You wrote, in the past 4 months, I have lost much of the dwindling love I had for both modernism and the great Anglo-American fantasy of functioning democracy. So, I mean, it was a review that was both uplifting, but also, boy, it took you to a deep, dark place. I'm wondering if anything has happened between now and then that has changed your outlook, or if you want to just, going back to the original question about the Black Lives Matter movement and how that's impacted all of our fields, if you want to address all of those.
Well, quickly, let me go back to June, July of 2020. I think I wrote the review of the new building in July 2020, and I think I may have toured it in June. In any case, it's May of 2020 that George Floyd is murdered. And May and June are some of the most volatile months that I remember in the 50-some years I've been on this planet of American history. And it seemed to me that one needed to celebrate the library because it was doing fundamental things that other organizations, other branches of government weren't doing, that our government was failing us. You know, my dad died of COVID in March of 2020, and I remember being furious because I would turn on the TV and I would hear the President of the United States say, it's gonna go away, it's not a real thing. He'd keep a boat offshore so his COVID numbers didn't go up. You know, I was angry, personally angry at that time. And I think, like a lot of people, our own personal sense of fury at how we were grappling with the pandemic became then supercharged by this bigger and more essential form of fury by how we had not grappled with or dealt with issues, basic issues of equity and fairness in our society that became so clear after the murder, or more clear, or just unavoidably clear after the murder of George Floyd. It seems to me that it is appalling that libraries are one of the major vectors for homeless people, for mental illness. That's not what they should be doing, but they're doing it because nobody else is doing it and because they know they can do it well. But how do we organize a society in which it's libraries that are doing this thing? I mean, that was the place I was in at the time that I wrote the review, which is to say, I think this is spectacular, and no matter what you think of libraries given, say, a 100 or 150-year arc of time, yes, they intersect with white supremacy if you go back to the 19th century. You look at the Carnegie Library, you look at the idea of the library as a civilizing institution. You bring the immigrants in, you give them this access to books, and maybe they're going to turn out like us, whatever us happens to be. Regardless of that history, to see where libraries are now in 2020 does give you a little bit of faith in some remnant of what the actual government, the people we elect, should be doing. I mean, that's the thing that I find so strange. Let me just briefly, because I know we're at the end, I wanted to say about Rebecca, I'm really glad to hear these numbers about the location of affordable units within historic districts. Because I think that historic preservation faces a bigger intellectual crisis maybe than we're comfortable acknowledging from the left at this point. There's a sense of urgency that comes out of what happened in 2020 in the past few years. That means we have to really rethink why and how we explain to people the importance of preserving buildings, and even more problematically, neighborhoods. Neighborhoods of 3-level Victorian houses that go on for blocks and blocks and blocks when you've got a climate crisis, when you've got a density crisis, when people are having to take multiple buses to get to low-paying jobs in the center of cities and then travel back out to far-flung suburbs. How do you explain why it's important to preserve those things? And the answer that I would give that intersects with what happened here and with the broader questions of what our government needs to do is that we cannot be a disposable society. We cannot simply throw things away. Not only because it's wasteful, but because we don't know what we're throwing away. And that's where it intersects with people. That's where the disposability of human beings within our larger society has been so appalling. We don't even know the losses that we've sustained through treating whole groups of people as disposable.
And that's an argument we get a lot. Well, it's not Paris. This isn't Europe. Well, we can't be Europe if we tear everything down. So, I mean, I think that just going off of what Anne said as well, telling these stories, we're doing a lot of partnership with them on the context studies, and we just actually were awarded a Latino context study recently this last week, and then African American civil rights, DCPL just started a Black Power document. I mean, all of these things to tell a broader story of Washington, I think will help us in the long run, that it is not this kind of, as Anne said, the old white guy's mansion. We're trying to tell the whole story of Washington that's important.
Great. So do you guys mind if we transition to maybe some questions? Yeah, you guys okay? Not too hot? I think it got a little bit cooler here, potentially. Thank you. So there's some fun ones in here, I can see. Thanks. I don't know if we'll get into all of these, but had the MLK Library not been landmarked, are there additional changes to the building that you would have supported? That
I
might
think
be
that's
a
for you.
question for me. Very quickly, I probably would have been in favor of making more dramatic changes to the lighting in the Great Hall, which I find still to be a little bit sort of institutional and austere, and I would like something a little bit more dramatic, but that would be a big no-no considering the pattern of the lighting that we've got down there. So that's probably a big one. And you know, I was always in favor of removing more of the brick at the entrance. Of course, I think it was you, Anne, that introduced me to the concept of compression coming into a vestibule, which then highlights the significance of the Great Hall behind it, but I still probably would have liked a little bit more transparency down there. And you can just wear your personal hats here. Anybody want to weigh in on that question?
It's beautiful just the way it is.
I have to say an early proposal, or earlier proposal from Meccano was the pods in the reading rooms on the first floor they're very Miesian, what was built, and very lovely, very high quality. Initial proposal were these sort of plastic or some sort of fiberglass red pods, like really red and big and tall and kind of amorphous. And I had to wear my preservation hat because that's what I get paid to do. And I did, and they were very Miesian what was built, but they were fun. I think that would have been fun to have some pop of color.
I knew you liked this.
I did like them.
Phil, anything, or want me to just move on? Can you share any examples of disagreements between the library and any of the regulatory agencies, and who ultimately prevailed?
Well, I think you just heard those.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Compromise. I mean, everything we did.
Yeah, it's a
everything was
negotiation. I
compromise.
mean, frankly, I'll say one aspect of the renovation that comes to mind, where the library lost but ultimately won. At one point during the early design phase, we proposed removing the parking ramp that goes out onto 9th Street for this beautiful little cafe patio. But as we got further into design development, we were way over budget. So we decided that, you know what, we're fine with the big, beautiful reading patio upstairs. We won't need that. But there was a tremendous amount of pushback for removing the idea. So we ultimately had to figure out how to budget that little cafe patio back in. And I'm really glad we did. In fact, I had a coffee there earlier today because my office was so hot. And I was like, boy, I'm glad that this is not a parking ramp. So that was a loss. Can you remember any, or Rebecca, in terms of the consulting parties, what some of the things that we might have been at odds about?
Well, you mentioned the brick. I know Anne and I had a lot of conversations about the brick in particular and removal of historic fabric in order to, when you're adapting a building for a current use, you make those types of compromises. So I think what we've gotten in return, though, from a mitigation perspective is going to be outstanding. So.
I wish It's kind of silly, but I really liked the revolving doors out front.
Oh, okay.
Because we see less and less of them because they're not environmentally wise. They don't keep the heat in and the air conditioning in, and so I get it, but they're going to be the phone booths of 2030 because there won't be any more. And so I did fight, but not hard, for those. And realized pretty quickly that was not going to be a smart thing.
But speaking of phone booths, we do have, if you guys walk through the various floors here, you'll see some of the old, they're not phone booths, they're more like phone kiosks. And those were kept as part of the mitigation of the changes we were making. Of course, they're not phones any longer, but they are charging stations. So people can go there and you can charge your phone in these things that I'm sure kids walk over to them. It's like, what the hell is this? But they look great there. I've got to say, the shiny metal object with the sort of buff yellow background, they really pop. So they're almost artistic in their role. Here's a question that I actually don't know the answer to, but I'll bet you some of you do. Who had the imagination to select Mies van der Rohe as the original architect for this building? I know this wasn't a local DC decision. This was done.
It was a General Services Administration.
Yeah.
They were using, as part of their programs, their building programs, they were using named architects, mid-century architects, like the U.S. Tax Court, Victor Lundy, those types of architects. And so they selected Mies for this particular property. And Mies was very well recognized by, the architecture community, known as one of the big five, in the world at that point. And so there was a lot of this kind of design excellence that GSA was trying to do across the country. And so that's how we benefited from this.
Other question, was there a relationship between the renovation architects and Mies van der Rohe? The answer to that question is yes, I know that. I know that, and one of you mentioned that there was a documentary film that was shot that was helps with our mitigation. It's a great film, by the way, if none of you have seen it. It's called A Legacy of Mies and King. This was funded by the Norwegian Cultural Group, and it basically follows our design architects through Washington, D.C., through many of our community meetings. It's about an hour long. It's freely available now on YouTube, so if you go home and just plug in A Legacy of Mies and King, you'll see actually a very well-made documentary. And within that documentary, the design team went and interviewed a man by the name of Jack Bauman.
Oh, right.
And I don't know if this was already 7 years ago or so. Jack was probably going on 90 years old. A phenomenal Chicago townhouse with all the Mies furniture. He's wearing an ascot. I mean, he just looked the part. And he was telling these great stories of the building, and the Meccano team really appreciated spending time with him. He even teared up talking about when he got the call that Mies had died. Of course, Mies had died while the building was under construction. So there was a relationship there. That was probably the most palpable one.
But there was a relationship, too, between the Preservation Architect and the Preservation League.
Yeah.
So Tom Johnson was the husband of Julie Mueller, who was a president of the DC Preservation League in the 1990s.
That's right.
So
That's right. Rebecca, can you discuss the relationship between the Seattle Library and the MLK Library? That's an interesting one.
wow.
It's the Rem Koolhaas, right? Office of Metropolitan Architecture.
Yeah, and glassy, open. Although when you're in Seattle, you're talking. You have escalators going up through it, and a lot of visualization. You don't have the. It's not really a great hall, so to speak. So because you have these, the escalator going up through it, you kind of have this sense of almost feels like a shopping mall sometimes on the inside. But the exterior of it is very beautiful. So I am somebody who personally likes framed spaces. So that's what I like about this particular building, is that there are designated spaces for things. It's not just one big open where it's like, okay, we'll put this over here and then we'll put this over here. It's very intentional because of Mies's design.
You know, in library land, many of us credit the Seattle Public Library for helping all of us in this country sort of better understand how a central library can serve its citizens. A lot has been written about the Seattle Public Library since it opened. There's a scholar by the name of Shannon Mattern who wrote a great book called The New Central Library, focused on the Seattle Public Library, with interviews with libraries around the country. But it really was sort of the game changer, I think, in early 21st century central library design. Very, very, very cool. Real quick, why is there no art on the bare brick walls in the main lobby? We're getting there. We are introducing more and more art to the building. Natalie Campbell, who's sitting over on the corner, you can raise your hand, Natalie. Natalie is working furiously with organizations to help us get more art on the wall, including the Commission of Arts and Humanities and a bunch of other folks, so we're really excited about that. This is the question for Rebecca, sort of back to what we were talking about before. Maybe we already addressed it. Not to put you on the spot, but are there new features of the library that the Preservation League wishes had not been included in the final construction? And maybe any of you can answer that too.
I can't think of anything at the moment that was really is out of bounds at this point. We're using it heavily, so we're pretty pleased with how it's progressed and become functional. I mean, especially from a public use perspective. And historic buildings are more successful when they're utilized, and especially public buildings. And so this is drawing people in, and getting bodies in this building is a really important way for us to say that it was a success and see preservation can work and still be a functional building for the city. So.
You?
You know, I was thinking, and my brain works differently. It's like what was removed that should have been kept, not what was put in or not put in. And I can't think of anything.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And you keep saying that this was like 2014 to 2017, and I'm like, God, this feels like it was like a decade ago. Like it was just like, seems so long ago now at this point, so.
Thank you for these. I think we'll pause on the audience questions unless there's a great demand to hear more of them. I do want, as we get to our 80th minute, just give you all a second or two to ask any questions among any of us or anybody in the audience that you see, or maybe offer sort of final reflections on 50 years of the Preservation League, 50 years of preservation in DC, 50th birthday of the MLK Library. And maybe we can start with Phil. We haven't heard you in a while.
Oh, I'll put Rebecca and, well, my two interlocutors in the spot. So the FBI building, what's... Is there momentum to think of this as a historic important building?
That's like an entirely different session, but there was a Section 106 that initiated a number of years ago, and the Preservation League has been pushing for it to be determined eligible, because what we believe will happen is that, because it's not 50 years old yet, and for National Register designation, it needs to be exemplary in that sense. You have to make that argument, and we don't necessarily think it's exemplary, but we do think when it turns 50, it does become eligible, because it is, GSA uses their own criteria, and it's that it's indicative of an agency. And the argument in the document against it being eligible was that it's mainly an administrative office, and the primary field work is done out of the field offices. That's where the investigatory work is done. Now, can any of you tell me any time where you've seen, where they've mentioned the FBI in a movie or on TV and they've not shown the Hoover building? I mean, they're not showing the field offices. And so instead of getting into a big preservation battle when it turns 50, our recommendation was that you should determine it eligible and let's move on from there. Not necessarily that the building gets kept, but where do we go from there, so that it's an authentic review, as opposed to well, we're just going to say it's not. And then we don't want to get in a situation then if it is eventually slated for demolition that some group comes in and says, well, we're going to file a landmark nomination on the building. Now then people have to make that. And so just for the benefit of the preservation program to be forward-thinking and ahead of the game, that is what I think should happen with it. That's not what's happened, but now we're broaching, 2026 is not far off. And I'll be the same age as it will be.
Unfortunately, that one's not my case, so I'm steering clear of it.
Great. So was that your final thought, Phil?
I was like,
That was kind of a shot from the hip, but I think that's actually the right answer, and I think that speaks well of the way to think about preservation of the building, because I find myself deeply ambivalent about the building. I go by it all the time, and I think, wow, this actually could be a really interesting street active building if we made some changes, and changes that actually got back to some of the original ideas about the building. And so the idea of saying, okay, let's put it in a place where it's eligible and think about it later, sounds to me like a smart way of not having to make the decision now, but not closing any doors, because I think there probably will be people who argue, and I may even be one of them, I don't know, that there's something in this building that actually is pretty fundamental to DC.
and the environmental ramifications of it are tremendous with that
That's a
particular
lot
building.
of concrete.
It's a lot of
Put
concrete.
in a landfill.
So, and like I said, nobody's saying we have to keep it yet.
And our office would probably agree with that. I
Right.
mean, well, it's up to the GSA.
Right.
But,
Yes.
yeah, renaming.
Any final thoughts?
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Likewise to you. Rebecca?
I'd like to thank you for hosting this and hosting us for our 50th anniversary celebration. I hope everybody will join us. I guess I'll finalize it with this. It's my favorite picture that I found from the Don't Tear It Down days. It's a little boy who is Russell Coiney's son that I recently found out, and he holds a sign in his really great 70s getup that says preservation, try it, you might like it. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, folks, I think we'll wrap up. You do have a little bit of time if you want to go check out the sunset upstairs on the 5th floor. We're adding a lot more program to this building every day. I'm hoping that all of you have had an opportunity to visit our new cafe downstairs, run by our good friends at the DC Central Kitchen. Our playground slide is now open every open hour that the library is open. And we are not prohibiting adults from taking it, but we are not recommending adults take it. And every week we'll have something new here for you. So thanks for coming. Appreciate you all sticking around, and enjoy your evenings.